My name is Cecil, and I'm a recovered alcoholic from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and I'm going to read just a little portion of what that says, and it's from the foreword of the first edition. Maybe some of you have read it, and maybe some of you haven't. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. For them, we hope that these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experience will help everyone to a better understanding of the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that an alcoholic is a very sick person, and besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages. I'm the oldest of 6 children. My stepbrother next to me, he was 4 years younger than I was, and he died 12 years ago of cancer. He also had 5 years of sobriety before he passed away. I have another stepbrother, or a half-brother in Phoenix, Arizona, that is 8 years younger than I am. I have a half-sister in Edmonton who is 22 years younger than I am. I have a stepbrother in Winnipeg who is 45 years old. I also have another stepbrother in Kitchener, Ontario, and he's 4 days older than my daughter. So that's a bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from today. I was born before Mom was married, okay? And that's why I have half-brothers and half-sisters and stepbrothers. But prior to that, when I was born before Mom was married, now I don't know how long or when I started living with my grandparents on my mother's side, but to this day I remember that I lived with Grandma and Grandpa until I was 6 years old. And then I eventually moved back in with my biological mother and stepdad. And during that time, when I was living with Grandma and Grandpa, you know, all the Grandma's kids would come home in the fall, and then Grandpa would butcher pigs for the whole family and this type of thing. But I was already there, you know. And when the rest of the cousins and that started coming in, how come they were coming in with their mom and dad and I wasn't? You know, I had that question, but it was never answered for me, you know, at least not at that time. During that course of the year, or time that I lived with my grandparents, I was also shipped back and forth with to uncles and aunts and this type of thing. And when I was 4 years old, I was sexually abused, and I remember that. Now, some people seem to say that you can't remember back that far. Don't kid yourself. You sure can. Now, I carried that for many years, and eventually I kind of buried that. Once I started school, there was other things that started to happen to me. It wasn't too bad. Then I started to live with my parents at that time. My stepfather, the only thing that I ever knew is he was my father. And I still looked at him, and still do today, as my biological father, even though he's just my stepfather, okay? But during that time, I was okay until I hit 13, and then trouble started. You see, I was born and raised in a Mennonite home, and it's very, very strict, you know. And one of the things, even when I lived at Grandma and Grandpa's, that I remember, you know, if I misbehaved, Grandma would holler at me, you know, God's going to punish you for that. He's going to get you, you know. That was driven into my brain when I was very small. And then when I started living at home, of course, that is still there. Now, my parents, too, were very religious in the Mennonite home. And that drove me up a wall. And finally, you know, I discovered booze at 13, and man, I hated the taste of that crap. I really did, but yet I went back for it, you know, because of what it did for this guy. It gave me that release, and it gave me an out on that pain that I was suffering, the emotional pains that I was suffering at home. And yet, you know, I'd go to talk to Mom or Dad about it, and they'd say, well, you're too young to understand. You know, wait till you grow up a little older. And that is not the way, to my notion anyway today, to bring up a child. You know, but that's, I suppose they did the best they could. So I put up with that, you know, until I hit 15, and I said, enough is enough, and I left. And I had the world by the tail then. Then I could do whatever I wanted, right? And it was a lot of fun. There really was, you know. It was all right. And even doing the school year when I was in school, from 13, 14, before I even left home, like I usually, you know, many times I got into trouble at school. For some reason, I could have all the women around me from school that you could name, and the rest of the boys, they didn't think that was the right way to be, you know. So anyway, every once in a while I got a bit of a licking from, you know, some of my peers, so to speak. Why that was, I have no idea, you know. But let's put it this way, I had fun, you know, even though that it didn't work out. But after that, after I left home, I never did return again. That was it. You know, I went home for visits and this type of thing. And my drinking really didn't increase that much. It was just a weekend thing. We did wreck a few cars. That year that I turned 16, I know that it wasn't a good year, because I did get into the booze for some reason a little heavy. And don't ask me why, because I don't know. I really don't. And we wrecked 9 cars in 1 month, you know. Never got hurt in any of them, really. But one of them, we dumped that into a big slough alongside of the road. And there was 4 or 5 of us in the car. But you see, the car is laying on its side and it's starting to go down, and we're all jumping out, but we left one guy in the car to hand all the beer out because we weren't about to let that go down the drain, you know. And we just about lost one of the guys. We just about drowned him, you know, before we got all the booze out. So that was, you know, a bit of the insanity of drinking, really, when it comes down to it. I think that after that, it's kind of slow. After we'd wrecked a few cars, my drinking started to slow down. And that was in about the time that I met a cute little gal that I enjoyed watching her across the dance hall, and I'll tell you, I made a beeline for that one. And that was 53 years ago in September, and I'm still with that one, you know. And, you know, why she stayed with me during my drinking career, I have no idea. She should have left me, but she didn't, you know, and she's still there. And to me, you know, that woman is probably still as beautiful today as she was then. And I sincerely mean that, you know. Even though she upsets me a few, you know, the odd time, and I don't agree, but what the heck. You know, you can't run smoothly all the time, eh? So anyway, there's that part of it. After we were married, the wife and I went together for 8 years before we we were married, eh? So and we did get married young, believe me. Then after we got married, my mother became sick, and they lived in Swiftcurrent, and she developed breast cancer. And the last month that she was alive, my wife and I drove from Beachy, which was about an hour and 15 minutes or something like drive time, and we drove that every night. And we'd go visit her, and then we'd drive home, so we'd go to work in the morning. When my mother passed away, she left behind a 5-year-old daughter, which is my half-sister in Edmonton, the one that's 22 years younger than I am. And it seemed like after that, and I still remember this today very clearly, that during the funeral, I never once cried, you know. I blocked that out, you know. I was upset, and I was and I was I had resentments against my mother for leaving us, you know, especially leaving a 5-year-old daughter behind. Eh? And that created some more problems. After Mother passed away, a year or two later, the company I was working for, I bought his implement dealership out. I had 22 people working for me, and I thought, wow, here we come. You know, I'm the boss. I can buy a case of whiskey, and I'll set that down there and put my feet up, and you boys got to do the work. Okay? Well, needless to say, that business didn't last all that long because I drank it, you know. And then the wife and I finally moved into Saskatoon. And after that, my drinking slowed down. My wife drank with me, and it was all right. You know. She then, it wasn't very long after we moved into Saskatoon, she became pregnant with our first child. And we lost that one, and my drinking escalated again. You know. Finally, it started to slow down again. Well, then she became pregnant with Bonnie, you know. And that was good, and I enjoyed that. But after the kid was born, now I've got all this responsibility, and all hell broke loose for breakfast. You know, and I did start drinking then. You know, now I've got to look after this kid. I've got to, you know, and I've got to pay bills, and my wife isn't working anymore. You know, now all that responsibility is on me, and I wasn't about to take that. You know. So it continued. The wife was off work for a while on maternity leave, and then she went back to work. And we had her parents actually moved into Saskatoon, and they babysat for us. And they lived in the same apartment block that we did. So that was, you know, that was real deal for us. You know, we didn't have to take Bonnie out or anything. Anyway, during the course of that time when Grandma was babysitting, Grandma loved her tea. And she just cooked her, you know, got herself a hot cup of tea. She set the cup on the corner like that. And the kid reached up, and she was walking, and she grabbed a hold of the handle, pulled it down on top of her, and it spilt right here. And it actually peeled the hide right off her from about here all the way down to about here. My wife phoned me where I was at work, and I went straight over to the hospital where at the university where she was at. And the minute I walked in that door, I could hear that kid screaming, you know, and it was god-awful. That in turn caused some more problems with my drinking, and it escalated again. It wasn't long after that after she healed up and she was doing all right, she developed another problem where all of a sudden her body temperature would rise up to 105 and 106, and it should have been convulsions, but it wasn't, you know. And we used to have to rush her into the hospital and have her bathed in alcohol to bring that temperature down. Anyway, my wife phoned me this one night and said, we got to take Bonnie to the hospital because her temperature is going up. And I said, I'll be right there. And at that time, I worked at the north end of town, and we lived on the east side, just off 8th Street. And of course, I had to drive through town, and I drove right past the Patricia Hotel. And believe me, I was very good at. There's a door right in front, right on the street. Eh? There was always a meter that was open for me, for some crazy reason. That night, I pulled in, and that meter was open, and I pulled in, and I'm going to have one quick one before I go home. My wife had already told me what was going on, and I should come home very quickly. Well, when you become an alcoholic, and I had no idea to this day where that fine line was, but it was there somewhere, and I must have been into it already. Because I went in for that one quick one, and I'll sneak out and I'll, you know, go home, and Mom won't know that I even stopped. Well, you know, our big book talks about you pick, it's that first one that gets you drunk, okay? And believe me, it did. That very first one, I thought, I'll just have that one. At 10:30 that night, my brother-in-law come walking in, and I'm sure that had he have not been charged with murder, he would have shot me because he was that mad, and I've never seen that man that mad since. or, or even before. Because he was so mad that I had threatened his niece, her livelihood, you see. But did it matter? Like, yes, I love my daughter. I did then and I still do today. But I threatened her life because of that drink. And this is what alcohol will do to me, when we go through our steps, it talks about cunning, baffling, and powerful. Well, that's a prime example of what happens when you pick up that first drink. Later on in life, my alcohol really increased to the point that I used to make a joke about it. I'm an alcoholic, and they say, "Oh, you're all right. Just slow down. Here, have another one." Okay? And that's all I wanted you to do, because I didn't have any money left in me, so that's why I said that, so that you'd buy me one. And it always worked. But after a while, that brought another problem. My wife would come looking for me, and she'd leave my 5-year-old daughter standing in front of that door, and she'd come in and get me. Again, I'm threatening my kid's life. Okay? By leaving her standing at that door, any sane person wouldn't do that, but I did. And every time she, hauled me out of the beer parlor like that, I'd go out, with like a damn dog with his tail between his legs, and away I'd go, and I'd follow her. Okay? And there it just kept on getting worse and worse, to the point that I started to drink very heavy. And I had a drinking buddy, and we always drank at the Travel Lodge. And, the barmaids knew exactly what table we were going. They didn't even wait for us to order. They knew exactly what we wanted, and they'd bring it. And I said, "Jesus, now that's service, eh?" Not knowing that I was in trouble. And anyway, we got hammered up this one night, and it was time to go. And at that time, they did close the beer parlor down after about 11:30, at night. You had to leave. So anyway, we got to leave. Him and I were pretty wasted. And he's going to drive his truck. I'd already ordered a cab for me. And I said, "You better have one too." And we get arguing. He's sitting in his truck, and the truck is running. And I'm standing in front of it, And finally he said some funny words, and he said, "If you don't get out of the way, I'll run over you." And he did. And I come out the ass end. And I was just drunk enough that I fell over this way, and the truck went over top of me. The next morning, my shirt is all full of grease, and my wife says, "What in the, where have you been?" I said, "Oh, I was helping somebody change a tire." It was no more a tire than, but that's what happened. It took some time before I could tell my wife that, and then, she knew anyway, really, when it comes down to it. My wife had a nasty habit. When I'd go out drinking, and many times I, come home at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and she'd be awake and she'd ask me where I'd been. And I'd give her some kind of a story. I learned very quickly that if I told her a story at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, I better be able to repeat that one word for word tomorrow morning, because I'll guarantee you she's going to ask me that same question. Okay? So I had to learn that one, and I did. But that didn't work either, I'd get into trouble with my wife, really, and then I'd stick around home for a while and gain some brownie points, so I could sneak out again. Became a real con artist at that. But prior to that, there was a time when we were still living in Beachy that I just about forgot about, and I must tell you about this one. The small community that we lived in, the men down there had a bad habit of getting hammered in the bar. At closing time, well, we better go look for another party. Okay? And my uncle that helped raise me started this one. He had put 3 other guys in the car, and they loaded the trunk up with booze, and they took off for Malta, Montana looking for another party. Okay? Well, if he can do it, then we can too. And we took off one night. And that, when I got home, of course, again, the wife starts asking me these silly questions about where we'd been, and we were gone for 4 days. The neat part of that little story is the fact that We were gone for 4 days, and the police never touched us. And the next morning, there's, you know, in a small community, there's 4 women that are missing 4 husbands. So they get phoning around to see what's going on, and they find out what's going on. So the women, they phone the RCMP. And the RCMP followed us for those 4 days. And when we'd get out of one detachment's area, they'd just phone ahead and say, these boys, this is the color of the car, the description, the license plates. These are the names of the guys that's in that car. And you know they never touched us. But what they did was as soon as we'd moved from one place to the other, the police would phone the women and let them know exactly where we were and what we were doing. You see. So when I get home, of course she's asked me where I'd been, and I don't even remember what kind of a story I told her. I really don't. 2 years after I sobered up, I was speaking at Welcome Group, and I'm talking about this. And I had never, ever mentioned that trip when my wife was around, and she was sitting there that night. And now, after we get done talking, she starts telling me that we knew exactly where you boys were. And I said, well, how did you know that? We had the RCMP tailing you. And I said, my God, how come you never told me that? She said it wasn't worth it. You know. But it was, how do you get away with stuff like that? I don't know. We did. And it's, I'm not proud of some of those things, I'll tell you that. Because, she worried about that. And then, of course, doing that career, that's when I said, that I'd owned that dealership, and I drank it, and then we moved into Saskatoon. That cost the wife and I an awful pile of money before I got that straightened out, and I did. I had to go into court over that, and, you declare bankruptcy. I didn't actually declare bankruptcy. I went into court, and my lawyer said no. He said, let's try something else. And he said, I told him I wanted to pay that, and I really did. When we went into court, my lawyer got up and said, this is what we propose. And all the creditors were sitting there, and you got to answer to them. I gave him the lawyer gave the judge the proposal that I wanted to do, that I wanted to pay for all this, but I could only do so much, and that if any of you creditors as much as even phoned me, the deal was off. And the judge didn't allow any of those creditors that morning to even speak to that. He said, you guys either accept it or you get nothing. And it was that simple. And I did pay for all that eventually, That set us back quite a ways, and eventually we could come back out of it again. Both the wife and I had to work as a result of it. But it's, it's interesting how the booze finally gets to you. So anyway, I'm running short, I'm backing into a corner gradually. And anyway, I decided that maybe I should, go see what you boys have got to offer. So I did. And I stuck around for a little while. But, you didn't fix nothing for me. You didn't teach me how to drink sociably or anything. So about 6 months after that, prior to that, about at the end of 3 months, I was already, after the meeting, I would sneak out to the travel lodge and have a quick one, go home so the wife never noticed. She didn't know that I was drinking, Well, apparently she did because she could smell that stuff, So that went on until after 6 months, I walked into the bar and I said, that's enough. And I walked in through that door, and there was a gal sitting there that I'd just been at the meeting with. And I turned around and walked out. And I thought, holy lightning. Did you know that I used to drive out here and drink? Because I wasn't about to have any of you guys catch me at a bar in Saskatoon. So that lasted for a while, and pretty soon I got brave enough so that I would start drinking back downtown again, where I figured that I didn't think you boys would show up anyway, And maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I don't know. I lasted 2 years drinking. And I had lost my license, and I come home, and of course I prior to that, after losing my license, I vowed that I would never drive after I was drinking. So I'd always hire two taxis, one to drive my car home and one to bring me home. Anyway, I did this one morning at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I've got these two taxis sitting in my driveway with my car in there, and I went to pay these guys. I don't have any money left, so I'm going to write them a check. Well, when you're drunk to start with, and you go to write a check for a taxi driver, look out, because the fight's on right there. So we got arguing, and my wife come out in her house coat, and she paid these boys off in cash. And she upset me to no end. She was interfering in my business. And I clenched my fist, and I was going to drive that old girl one. And I didn't. To this day, I have no idea what stopped me. But something stopped me, and I didn't hit her. 1 week later, I knew that I'd hit the end of my rope, and that something had to be done. And that I went into the house after I come home from work the next day, and I phoned Larson House. And that was when Larson House was owned and operated by Cecil and Edith Larson. And I knew exactly what day I wanted to quit drinking. And it was a week down the road before they gave me a bed in Larson House. During that week, I went out and I spent over $10,000 on new carpet for the house, a new piano for the kid, 2 new snowmobiles and a trailer, and all the paraphernalia that you need to snowmobile, suits and the whole bit. And the reason I bought 2 of them is my kid is going to come with me. My wife just about had enough of me right there. I had drained the bank account pretty good by this time, and where am I going to, how am I going to spend $10,000 or pay back $10,000? And at that time, that was a lot of money, Because remember, this is 36 years ago, or a little better. I knew exactly how I was going to pay for it. I had absolutely no doubt in my mind. And because I was going to Larson House come Friday, and this is the weekend before. And the piano people pull up, and the wife says, "What in the hell are they bringing in now?" Pretty soon, instead of me towing this trailer home with these 2 new snowmobiles, I had them deliver that, because I was afraid to even hook onto it with my truck and bring it home for fear she'd shoot me or something. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Wasn't very long after that, Beehive pulls up. They got to measure all the carpet, and I carpeted the whole house. And I had some of the most beautiful hardwood floor in that living room, but I covered it. Totally insane. My wife went next door crying because of what I was doing, because she couldn't handle this anymore. Pardon me. And yet I knew exactly how I was going to pay for it. And this is where it comes now, where I've hit the end of my rope, and I know that I'm going to quit drinking. And I'm going into Larson House on Friday, and I knew that because I had a bed. During that time, that Friday morning, I had a 40 underneath the seat of my car. And I pulled that out on the way to work that morning. And I pulled that down about that much on the way to work, and I nursed that until 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, I stopped at the Travel Lodge, and from what they told me afterwards, I had drank another 40. And not once did I get drunk. I couldn't. And don't ask me why about that one, because I don't know. But I'll tell you what else that I do know. And I was trying to drown myself in alcohol because I really didn't want to go to Larson House, believe me. I couldn't face that kind of a humiliation, if you want to put it. And it was, one of the greatest humiliations that I'd ever done. Anyway, that night, when I did get home, it was about 7 o'clock, I had a quick shower. I don't even remember whether I had supper or not. My wife drove me to Larson House. And when I walked in that door at Larson House, I'll guarantee you one thing. Something happened to me that day. And the moment I walked through that door, and just as I was left the car, the wife said, well, when you find out you've got a bed, come out and tell me. Do you know that there was absolutely no way that I could walk back out of that detox center? The paranoia that hit me right at that moment, for me to walk through that door, was absolute suicide. And I knew that. And I never did go out. After a while, my wife realized that I wasn't coming back out again, So she went home. And this is why I really appreciate this group. Because that night, and it was a Friday night, and different groups would chair the AA meeting upstairs. And there was 19 of us that morning up there. And Cecil wanted to know if I wanted to go to that. And I said, yes, I really do. When I got upstairs, and everybody's taking their turn, and the two boys were from this group that chaired that meeting, so help me God, I wish I could remember the names, but I don't. All I remember is the fact that it was the Delisle group that chaired that meeting upstairs that night. And one of the boys that was chairing, he'd gone around the room and asked everybody if they wanted to, if they had anything to say. The one lad asked me if there was something that I wanted to say, and I said yes. And I said my name was Cecil and that I was an alcoholic. And right there, that was the last time I was able to speak for over an hour. I went into crying, and the staff finally had to put me to bed, just that way. And I wasn't crying because I was sad or afraid. I was crying because of the beautiful feeling that I was having. The weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulder for the first time in my life. That I could breathe. And it for me to try and even describe that feeling is virtually almost impossible. And since that day, on August 30th, 1975, when my wife hauled me down there. And the reason I couldn't walk out, I was afraid if something would happen, that somebody would spill some drinks on me or something. I don't know what it was. But the release I felt upstairs with that meeting is one that I've never felt before, and I've felt it a few times since. I have never, ever, since that very moment, had the desire or the urge to ever pick up a drink. It disappeared that very moment. And that's why I was crying, is because of the release. Remember I was talking to you about I'd spent $10,000 and I knew exactly how I was going to pay for it. And I knew when I walked through those doors that day, the same thing was there. I would never ever have to pick up another drink if I didn't want to. How did that happen? And that, of course, is my step one, isn't it? And I went to sincere, awesome believing that was my last. And I accepted what had happened to me. And I had no qualms with it anymore. And our big book talks about no one wants to admit complete defeat. And I did. And I had no trouble with that. And after that, I didn't have to sit up here or stand up here and tell you that my name was Cecil and I was an alcoholic. I didn't even have to tell you that. All I had to know was I knew what was wrong here. And I believed that, and I accepted that. Step two, it came to believe that a power greater than ourselves would restore me to sanity. I had already accepted a higher power, and I had no idea what it was. None whatsoever. But obviously I had, because of what happened to me that day that I walked through those doors. You know, I didn't do that on my own free will, let me tell you that. There was something that gave me that strength to do that, you know. And I'll be forever grateful to God, as I understand, for that one. And that's a gift that was given to me. And I don't treat that lightly. And then in 3, it says we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand them, you know. And I enjoy that one today. I didn't, you know, in the beginning I really didn't know what that meant. I really didn't. Because you see, when I was brought up in that Mennonite home, I hated God and I hated organized religion, and I wasn't about to get involved in that, you know. So as time went on, my first sponsor, Ronnie R., who is, he was 20 years younger than I am and is today. After I come out of Calder and Larson House, he was the one that decided that I needed a sponsor, and he took me under his wing, and away we went. And he led me through those steps, one by one. And I argued with that guy like you wouldn't believe some nights, you know. But while I'm doing that, there's something else that was going on in my home. And believe me, at the end of 2 years, I almost got a divorce. And I'm not joking when I say that. My wife and daughter were ready to leave me, you know. Because you see, I went to 7 meetings a week for 2 solid years. Because that was the only thing that I knew how to protect this guy, that he wouldn't pick up a drink or something would happen to him. Eh? Anyway, my family is now seeing way less of me than they did when I was drinking. And that's what caused the problem. Eh? Thank God for Al-Anon. They got a hold of her and said, well, how do you want this asshole? You want him drunk or you want him sober? Leave him alone. You know. And I remember one of the Al-Anon ladies that helped my wife through that one, telling me that, you know. And I'm ever grateful for Al-Anon for that one, because I still am convinced that they saved my marriage right there, you know, because it was close. Even when I was drinking, for heaven's sake, it was never that close, you know. So how do I turn my will and my life over to the care of God, as I understand, when I don't believe in that, you know? And I went to the United Church minister, Reverend Stuart Dingwall at the time, Mayfair United Church, because my wife and I were members of that church. I was a steward in that church, you know. And I talked to him about it, and he said, well, number one, he said, how long have you been sober? And I can't remember how long that was, but I gave him some kind of a number that, you know, satisfied him, I guess. And he said, well, isn't that wonderful? He said, finally you've got something that's keeping you sober. And he said, and I said, well, I don't want to, you know, use the word God. And he said, well, what is keeping you sober? And I said, it's you people that are sitting around these tables that is keeping me sober. And he said, you know, if that's what you believe, then that is your higher power. Hang on to it and use it. He said, eventually you'll, and then he led me back to step 2, that I would come to believe in a power that is greater than myself. Eh? And that gave me some freedom. It gave me freedom again that I hadn't experienced before. You know. Now, when we start looking at 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory. Well, my first one was, it got me by, I'll tell you that. And I wrote down everything that I thought the priest was wanting to hear. Well, I didn't put anything down of the amount of times that I had been sexually abused, and believe me, I was. Right up when I was in grade 7 or 8, and these high school boys, grade 12 students, and don't kid yourself, I had resentments against there for a long time. And the funny part of that story is the one in particular, before I came into this program and was able to look at step 4 and make that searching and fearless moral inventory, I wished that that sucker would die. And you know he did. And it was after that, when I came to you people, and I had to deal with that. you know. And that hurt, you know. And somehow I had to look at these resentments, and Ron helped me through those, you know. And I argued with him, and I said, no. He said, there's no way that I'm going to forgive that so-and-so. And for me to today, as I understand, for me to carry a resentment, I'm threatening my sobriety, and I won't last very long when I'm going to die drunk. So I had to do something about that. And he helped me with that. But that first step forward that I did, and I went back to Reverend Dingwall about that one, you know. And I just told him just what I thought he wanted to hear. And it got me by for another year. It really did. Then one night, my sponsor and I, we'd been to a meeting, and he dropped me off. And wasn't very long, all of a sudden my phone rings. And he said, how bad do you want to stay sober? And I said, Ron, what's the matter with you? I want to stay sober. Well, he says, that's sure good. He says, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in PA, you've got an appointment with the priest to do your 5. I thought, holy lightning. Now I've got to phone the boss and tell him I'm not going to be at work tomorrow morning, you know, and the whole 9 yards. As soon as he hung up the phone, I sat down. And I didn't have to write down all those other things, but I had to write down all those things that I had missed. And the anger, the fear, the resentment. And you know that I had absolutely no problem in writing all that down. It just as though I was on autopilot. And I wrote all that down. And when I arrived in PA, I dumped that all out. And I really felt good. When I got back to Saskatoon that day, I was exhausted. The wife had a nice supper for me, and I sat down and I ate that, and she said, you better go to bed. And I said, no. And I picked up the phone, and I phoned Ron, my sponsor. And I said, I want to see you. I said, put the coffee pot on. Do you know that I went over there to his house, and I spent the next 3 hours going over my fourth step again with him. And you knew the neat part of that was the fact that while I was doing that, he brought out some things that I had totally forgot about, you know. And I'll be forever grateful to that man for sitting there and listening to me again, you know. Have I ever had to go back and do another 4 and 5? I continue to do that because I get involved in big book studies, and, you know, periodically there's stuff that comes up. And it wasn't very long ago, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I just forget what it was. I was in church and I was listening to the sermon, and the minister said something that triggered a memory in me that I almost got to the point where I hated him for a split second or two. And it was something that happened to me that when I was about 7 or 9 years old, somewhere in that. And it was something that I buried. I knew it was there, but totally forgot about it. And all because of what he said triggered my memory. That's 67 years ago. And now I have to deal with that. But I'll tell you something. I've been given the strength to be able to look after that. I have no qualms about stepping up to the plate and looking after that. You know. What has happened, believe me, it has caused some problems in my marriage for the last 53 years. And I didn't even know it. And even if I was to ask my wife about it now, she probably wouldn't even know. I have no idea. But I'll tell you, it's got to be straightened out. Because of how I feel here, you see. So after that, 6 and 7, and we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, you know, and make, in this type of thing. When I hit 6, I was entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And I sincerely mean that. Because it was just like doing step 1. It was that important to me. Because now I want to sincerely change my life to something that I've dreamt about, you know. So that's going to mean some work. And I did exactly what the book said. When I went back and saw Ronnie, I had already read, like the book tells me, you know, after completing 4 and 5, Year 5, we're supposed to take a quiet hour and do some reading and make sure that we hadn't omitted anything. And I did that. And I was sincere when Ronnie and I knelt that night. And we asked for that, I did. And I've never had any trouble with that. That doesn't mean that I don't go back and pick up some of those things. You bet I do. And I pay for it afterwards. Today I'm starting to recognize these things. I'm aware of them. And the minute I attempt to use them, I back away. And all it takes is 5 to 10 seconds for me to say, God, help me through this one. And if I do that, I back away from whatever shortcoming or whatever I was about to use. If I was going to use my sharp tongue, which I have, I back away and I didn't harm you. So I didn't have to go back and apologize. See? 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed, and I got into trouble with that. The first 6 months I was in the program, sincerely. I went to make an amend to my stepmother. And I blew that out of the water, and I wasn't even close to it. And that woman never spoke to me for the next 2 years because of what I had done. When I got back into Saskatoon, I told my sponsor about that, and he ripped me a new one right there. He was so mad at me. And he said, what makes you think that you're on step 8 and 9? He said, I didn't tell you that you could go there. You didn't have a vote on that yet. I said, okay. So anyway, we got into that, and then he sat down with me, and we made that list properly. And we went through that, and all the names that were on there. He said, why are you apologizing? Why do you think you owe him an amend? And I had to go through that with him, And thank God for that. And I really am, Then in 9, there was one name on that list. I had no idea how I was going to make an amend to that. And it was to my mother, who had long gone, passed away. How do you make amend to someone that's gone? I'll tell you, the answer's in here. And I found it. I had to go to her gravesite. And you know that the day that Mom was buried, that it took 22 years before I ever went back to visit her grave. I couldn't. But I did the day that I made my amend to my mother. And that's a gift that God gave me, And I feel free of that one too, because I treated Mother like horrible. I won't even go into that. 10 and 11 to me are package deal, that continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it, and then sought through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God as I understand Him. And I like to look at that in the morning or at night, and I do it both ways. And it's amazing what happens to this boy and what I can pick up, And how do I feel when I crawl into bed? I feel jolly good. And I can sleep well because I know that I've done the best I could today. And some days my best is not all that good, And I some days, even today, after all these years of being sober, really that's my past. And that really doesn't help me. It's where my feet are today. And I can become not a very good husband. Or I can become not a very good father. And I got to correct myself on those. And that still happens. But I'm aware of that problem today. And I can do something about it. And I don't have to go into it, That doesn't mean that my wife doesn't upset me every once in a while, and with little things she does, and especially right now, where we're packing suitcases like you wouldn't believe. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. My spiritual awakening was the day that I went into Larson House, had no idea that that's what happened to me, but because I went through those 12 steps, and I had someone that helped me with that, thank God, I found out that I'd already had that. And it's still there today. What a beautiful way that God has given me. Some of the things that have happened to me, I can't even begin to tell you what has happened to me in the last 36 years. It's unbelievable, And one of them that I'm going to tell you about right now is the fact that my wife and I are leaving for Germany on Friday. My daughter and son-in-law who live there are paying for this first class. Okay? I've got a Mercedes sitting in the airport for me when I get there. All expenses paid. Okay? I wouldn't have that. You know, my daughter hated me. My wife hated me at times. The stupid dog, for heaven's sake, when I'd come home drunk, would hide. Okay? And I'm not joking when I say that. That's the way it was. After I sobered up, it didn't take very long. It didn't matter what time of the morning or night I come home. That dog would be at the door wagging his tail. Okay? Animals aren't stupid, let me tell you. I had the privilege last night of sitting with a gentleman that is very desperate. And he wants this program like you wouldn't believe. And I sat and I started to go through his step 5 with him. You know, and the poor guy, I really felt for. I said, who have you got that's helped you go through these steps? I said, who's your sponsor? Well, and I didn't go any further into that. I said, did he help you with those 12 steps? No. And I said, well, you and I are done with this 5th step. Because I said, there is no way that you know what you're doing right at this moment. The only thing he had on his list was the women that he had harmed during his drinking career. And I said, what about your mom? What about your dad? What about your brother? And on down, how about an uncle? He mentioned one uncle, you know. And I said, what about him? Don't you have a resentment about him? Well, not really. And that's when I stopped the 5th step. And we got into talking about how to, you know, the stuff that he was missing. And the reason I was able to tell him what he was missing is because I did the same trick, you know. This morning he asked if I could find him a new sponsor last night. This morning, at 7:30 in the morning, I presented him with a new sponsor. One that he all of a sudden enjoyed immediately. And that was, you know, for me that's a gift that I can sit and watch what happens to an individual when they all of a sudden accept there's something wrong with them, you know. And we must let go. We have to. That's the only way that I know of. I had to let go, you know. When I went into Larson House, for instance, I really didn't care whether my job was going to be there or my wife and daughter were going to be there or my house or all my cars that I had sitting in a brand new home in a driveway were going to be there. I really didn't care. It really didn't matter anymore because what I wanted was sobriety. And I wanted some peace of mind, and I got it. And you people gave it to me freely. Just before I close, there's a little thing that I want to read here. Look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the realities, the varieties of experience, the bliss of growth, the splendor of action, the glory of power. And then it goes on. For yesterday is but a dream, for today is only a vision, but today we lived. Makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day. And I'd like to thank you for everything.